Now I'm recording.
Okay.
So, welcome.
Okay, well, thanks so much for having me. My apologies, my Icelandic's not very good, so I'll have to do this in English. So my name's Jonathan. I'm from Montreal in Canada, and I'm one of the founding members of Basic Income Quebec, Revenu de Base Quebec, which is a citizens action group for basic income in the province of Quebec, and I'm the spokesperson for Quebec for the Canadian. There's a Canadian Basic Income Network, and then there's a provincial one. So in Canada, um, it's a fairly decentralized power structure where there's 10 provinces and 3 territories, and each province really controls the vast majority of government business, so healthcare, education, infrastructure, things like that. Whereas the federal government really only controls monetary policy, foreign policy, military affairs, interprovincial affairs, so a fairly narrow scope of work. So the provinces have the bulk of the power. So there's a group at the federal level called Basic Income Canada Network, and then there's the one at the Quebec level that I'm a part of as well. So I guess I didn't prepare anything too formal. I really actually want to hear from everybody here about what's happening in Iceland with the Pirate Party and with Basic Income, and hopefully have a good discussion about how to move the issue forward in Iceland, and explain a little bit what we're doing in Canada, and see if there's something we can learn from each other. Um, so I'll give you a short update on what's happening in Canada, what the status is, what we've done in the last few years, and kind of our point of view on how to move the issue forward. And then I have maybe a couple ideas to share about what I've seen, not just in Canada, but also in Europe, around basic income, different campaigns, whether it's Switzerland or Finland or the Netherlands or France. And then try and open up for some discussion. That's the basic agenda that I planned in the last 5 minutes in my head. So in Canada, it's not very complicated. There's two ministers that are both very supportive of basic income. One at the federal level, who's responsible for family and social something, not social, all social programs, just like family programs. And then there's a minister at the Quebec level whose name is François Blais, and he is in charge of the government title is employment and social solidarity. And he wrote a book on basic income about 15 years ago that was quite popular, and it's very good. It's in French. And so both those ministers support basic income, which has created a bit of an opening in Canada to move the issue forward. So thanks to them, and there's a senator in Canada. So in Canada, the federal level, we have two chambers. We have a Senate, which is appointed, and we have a Democrat Parliament, a representative Parliament, like the British Parliament. And there's a senator that's been in the Senate for a very long time who's a very big supporter of basic income, and so he managed to convince the province of Ontario to start a pilot project. Hasn't started yet. They're doing consultations now on what it's going to look like, but they have put some money aside in the budget to do a pilot project. So there is possibility they'll have a pilot project in the province of Ontario later this year in 2017. And the province of Ontario is the biggest province in Canada. It's about 15 million people, and all of Canada is about 34 million people. So it's almost half of Canada lives in Ontario, and they're ready to do a pilot project starting later this year, depending if the government survives or not. Well, that's another. I'll try to stay focused here. So that's happening, and then in Quebec, there's been a couple. There's one government conference where they invited 4 basic income specialists to come and speak, and the premier of Quebec, so the leader of the province of Quebec, and all of his ministers were there, and I was there as well, and I participated in the panel. And the panel was very, very good. It's mostly in French, so you can find it online, but it's mostly in French. There's no subtitles, but it brought in a fellow by the name of Jürgen de Visper, who's working on the Finnish pilot project right now in Finland, but he used to be in Montreal. A French guy by the name of Basquiat, who did a very detailed modeling on how basic income could be implemented in France based on their social programs. Evelyn Forget, who studied the basic income pilot projects in the 1970s that took place in Canada and in the United States. And the Yannick talked about the philosophy of basic income, you know, philosophically, why do we want basic income? Then we have one fellow, the Basquiat fellow, talking about really the mechanism, like how would you do this with the current social system that we have, or that they have in France. Evelyn Forget talked about, you know, how to design, or what she learned from the pilot projects in the 70s in the US and Canada. And then Jürgen, who's in Finland now, spoke about how they've designed the Finnish pilot project and what the constraints were, and why it's as you mentioned earlier, it's more of a replacement of welfare programs for now, rather than a true basic income. So anyways, it was very interesting, and it gave a broad perspective on the issue. So in Canada, the issue is slowly moving forward. There's consultations going on in Ontario around this pilot project. There's been other city mayors especially who've come out in favor of a basic income, as well as there's one very small province all the way on the east coast called Prince Edward Island that has about, I think, 150,000 people that live on the island. And they've said that they would like to be the test bed potentially for a basic income, because it's an island, it's 150,000 people, it wouldn't cost too much to do a pilot project there. So there's a talk of using that province as a pilot project for basic income. And then we're working on it in Quebec, trying to grow the issue, make it more well known. And the government we have at the provincial and the federal level is, and both in Ontario and Quebec, is fairly similar to the Finnish government, so sort of center right. And a lot of the talk around basic income is about reducing government costs, trying to make things more efficient, and helping people who are in this poverty trap. At least in Canada, if you're on welfare and you start working, you start losing your welfare payments. So there's a disincentive to work unless you find full-time work, which is, as we know, harder and harder in many countries, especially Canada. So, I mean, that's a bit the status in Canada. It's slowly moving forward. There is a public discussion going on, and there's been some interesting things that have developed. For example, a left-wing, center left-wing, I should say, think tank, which would traditionally have been associated to unions and to more progressive socialists or social democrats in Canada, came out quite against a basic income, basically saying that it would undermine sort of the welfare state that's been established over the 20th century, and it was really a tool of sort of neoliberals or liberals to try and reduce the size of the state. And they were fairly influential in Canada. So that was an interesting event, at least in the Canadian context, where we had progressive people, center-left, who generally are for helping the poor and trying to lift people up, who came out against a basic income. And for slightly more complex reasons than what I just said, but I'm trying to summarize it. So I guess that just leads me to kind of my observations on basic income, and I'd say there's two that I want to throw out more as questions, than I don't have any great solutions. One is something that this fellow Jürgen de Vilsper really talks about a lot, is in the basic income movement we see a kind of the dream is to have a coalition of left and right-wing people, because basic income appeals to right-wing people who want to reduce the size of the state and have individual freedom and liberty for each person. And then of course it also appeals to certain more progressive and people who want to help everybody and make sure everybody has a floor under their feet to stand up on. So there's this idea that we could form a coalition around the left and the right around basic income. And at least Jürgen de Vilsper, and all his papers are online, is quite interesting. He argues that this sounds nice in principle, but in reality it's probably highly unlikely that you're just not going to be able to get in the same room a neoliberal or libertarian person to agree with someone who wants to make sure everybody has a certain amount of wealth. And so I've seen that a little bit in Canada, where we have this interest from some more right-wing people, we have interest from more left-wing people, but as soon as we start talking about details, where earlier you were asking about how much would it be in Iceland, the discussion really can devolve quite quickly, and that coalition that we think we can build, it's less than obvious how to do it. So that's something that we've struggled with, is who are you appealing to? Who are you trying to convince that this is a good idea? Is it everybody? Is it the left-wing people, the right-wing people? And that's a bit more of a question. And one thing that at least I've come to the conclusion, or I'm thinking about a lot these days, is will basic income, to really get implemented, a real basic income, and I've kind of skipped over the whole definition of basic income, I'm going to I should have done this at the beginning. But when we're talking about basic income in Canada, and I think this is generally true around the world, is we're talking about um, transferring an amount of money that is sufficient to have a basic standard of living that's given on a universal basis, so it's given to everybody. It's unconditional, you don't need to apply for it or fill out any forms or have any sort of criteria, and it's given to the individual. So it's not given, the amount is not based on the household, which a lot of social programs are. It's really given to each individual, potentially children as well. So that's the definition we work with at least. And we try to avoid mentioning an amount in most of our discussions for a variety of reasons. But just going back to the coalition idea, one thing, and especially kind of pertinent since we're in a pirate party building or office, is I'm starting to think that to get a real basic income in place, whether it's in Canada or elsewhere, might require the formation of a political party that has as its number one principle and priority a basic income. Because a basic income is such a radical transfer in power from the state and the both the elected officials and the bureaucracy to the individual. It is such a radical transfer of power. We saw it in Switzerland, where they got this petition to have a national referendum on basic income, and every single parliamentarian, 100% unanimously said you should vote against basic income, which I thought was quite interesting, because at first they were not so clear on that. They were saying, oh yeah, it's kind of interesting, let's talk about it, let's talk about it. But I think as they realized exactly the full implications of a basic income in terms of distributing power, because money is a form of power, it's just accumulated power, in terms of distributing a basic income to everybody and therefore distributing power to everybody, the parliamentarians said, oh, okay, no, this is a really big change, and they all suggested that people vote against it, and we know that in Switzerland, only about 30% of people voted for basic income. I shouldn't say only, I mean that's still quite a bit, so there's a very huge accomplishment what they did in Switzerland. But anyway, so that's kind of one point I'd like to have a discussion around that, especially with folks like you who are involved in a party, a new party that's coming up the ranks in Europe especially. So does a basic income require a political party who has as its founding principle the idea that everybody should have a basic income? So that's kind of one point that's really more of a open-ended question. And then the second thing that I've been trying to do in Canada, and this is also a point for discussion, is trying to pitch a basic income more as a citizen's dividend than as a social program. Because we saw what happened with this left-wing think tank in Canada, where they came out quite against a basic income. And the reason they came out quite against a basic income is they viewed it as a way to replace a whole bunch of different social programs that have different purposes and different intents and different amounts with something that's much simpler and that could potentially harm a lot of certain groups of people. So certain elderly people who had 4 or 5 programs giving them money would now only have a basic income and they get less money, and they go through all the more detail. But and also making it a better sell to sort of the business and the mainstream middle class working community. Because a lot of the time they come back and say, well, why should we give money to everybody, or why should we give money to wealthy people, or what? And a basic income, you get pigeonholed, which is kind of a Canadian or English expression. It's like you get by pushing it as a transfer program, another transfer program on top of all the other ones we have. It gets pushed into this box of social programs. It says, oh, it's just another social program. How much are you going to cost? How much, or how are we going to finance it? Things like that. And you get caught in this trap where we can't raise taxes anymore. People are tired of paying more taxes. I mean, that's just a cultural thing that has happened over the last 25 years, thanks to Thatcher and Reagan and other reasons. But we have pigeonholed this thing. How are we going to pay for it? And we don't have the money for it, and we don't want to raise taxes, and therefore we can't do it. Whereas if you pitch it as a citizen's dividend, so you say it's not a social program, and really advertise that and say this is really about a fundamental right. If you're a member of a society, whether it's Iceland or another society, you have a fundamental right to a certain amount of money. You have a fundamental right to a percentage or a part of the community's wealth. So there's a lot of accumulated wealth in different countries, and the idea is whether you're born rich or poor, you should have the same amount of that communal wealth. So it's not about imposing taxes on certain people, but more about trying to find the money in things that are commonly owned. When I say commonly owned, what I can talk about is day, if you didn't own land, you were basically, you became a laborer and you had very limited wealth. So a land tax, or if you pollute air, we all breathe the same air, we drink the same water, if companies or different activities are polluting, you could tax that. The spectrum, so when we lease out the telecommunications spectrum for radio, television, cell phones, etc., there's only so much spectrum, technically speaking. You could take a percentage of the revenues from that and pay to the citizens or put it into a fund that then pays a dividend. So in Alaska, you have the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is somewhat like this. It's a fund that was largely financed through their oil money, and a percentage of the return on investment of that fund every year is given to the citizens. And it's wholly in Alaska. Like, there's no way any politician can take this away. Once it's been established, it becomes part of the fabric of the society, just like the right to vote. I mean, what I try to pitch the basic income as is a right to vote. It's a right to have a certain level of freedom that allows you to participate in society. Which comes back a bit to the first point, like, to get the right to vote in most countries, there had to be violent revolutions or people have to be willing to die for it. And it sounds a bit dramatic, especially in this day and era of a very peaceful existence for most people in the developed world. But the question, someone wrote an article of this a few months ago called Stop This Basic Income Bullshit, which was actually a very good article against, not so much against the concept of basic income, but rather against the possibility. And his main point was, if people weren't willing to die for this, it probably will never happen. Because the power structure is such. Someone was mentioning earlier how hard it is to read your constitution, which we tried to do in Iceland, and which hasn't succeeded yet, hopefully. But how hard it is to read. The constitution is about two things, right? It's about protecting individual liberty and distribution of power for your power structure. Fundamentally, that's what a constitution is about. And so changing the constitution is extremely hard because you're changing the power structure, and people in power don't like that. And basic income, in my mind at least, is similar. It's changing the power structure. It's to such a level people in power, either with money or in office, aren't going to be thrilled about it. So those are kind of two of the big challenges that I see for moving the basic income movement forward. And there's one of the heads of BN, the Basic Income Earth Network, made an interesting point at a conference a little while ago, was this is the third wave of basic income in the world. So we had a first wave that was kind of early 20th century. You had different thinkers and people that were advocating for basic income in Europe primarily, and it got quite a bit of traction. But then you had the First World War, and then the 30s, and then the Second World War. So that died off kind of in around 1920 after the First World War. But you had people advocating quite prominently, intellectuals, people like David Hume and others advocating for basic income in Europe. And then you had a second wave in the 1960s, 70s, where you had these pilot projects in Canada and the US, partially because you had you had a lot of wealth that was being created, worker wages were increasing, and it seemed possible that we could end poverty for everybody. And then we had the inflation and different things that, and the petrol crisis in Iran that kind of killed that one, and it killed the pilot project in Canada, for example, and then in the US under Nixon. And now we're sort of in the third wave. We're in the third wave, which is partially due to automation, robots, Uber, Airbnb, different things where people are rethinking the notion of work and labor and revenues. And the question is this enough? Will we be able to push it over the ledge and get a basic income in the next 5, 10 years in 1 or 2 countries? Or is it just going to peter out for some reason that we maybe can't foresee right now? And that was a point that I thought was quite interesting to put in that historical context, that this isn't the first time that basic income has been on the public agenda, and there's huge obstacles that face us to get it implemented. So that's kind of what's occupying our thoughts in Canada. Situation in Canada looks good in the sense that they're talking about a pilot project and talking about different things, but at the same time, they're not doing a lot of other things, and we're not sure what the best approach is to some of these challenges. So that's kind of all I had to say. I'm happy to answer any questions and clarify anything. I'm also keen to learn, what everybody's up to here and what's happening in Iceland and Pirate. And thank you so much for the invitation, for organizing.
Right. Thank you. Now we can have a deal one discussion.
do we wanna do a round table and just everybody introduces